The Galactic Council chamber was massive and filled with beings from across the stars, and Commander Daniel Harper stood at the podium wearing his best uniform under the strange purple lights, and he had practiced his speech for months because this moment would decide Earth's future in the galaxy. And behind him stood Lieutenant Amy Patterson, holding the data tablets that contained all of humanity's achievements and everything they had accomplished in just 70 years, since first contact with alien life. Daniel began speaking, and his voice carried through the translation systems to reach every species in the chamber. And he asked for one simple thing, which was for the Council to recognize humanity as equals and allow them to join the galactic community as full members. And he believed they had earned this right because humans had achieved faster than light travel on their own, and had made peaceful contact with over 40 different species, and had followed every rule the Council had ever given them. The Vrix delegate rose from its seat, and this creature looked like a giant insect with eyes that reflected light like mirrors, and when it spoke, the translator made its clicking sounds into words that everyone could understand, and those words were not kind because the delegate said that humanity's request had been denied, and that humans were too young and too violent to join the Council, and Daniel felt his stomach drop, because this was not what he had expected after all their hard work. Daniel tried to argue and pointed out that humanity had met every single requirement listed in the membership rules, and Amy stepped forward to help, and she reminded the Council that every conflict humans had been involved in was defensive and never aggressive, but the Council members just made dismissive sounds and acted like human words meant nothing at all. A Kelvin representative spoke next, and this species looked almost human, except for silver skin and no eyes. And it said that humans had been in 17 armed conflicts in just 2 centuries of space travel. And Daniel tried to explain that pirates and raiders had forced every single one of those fights, but the Council did not want to hear explanations or facts. Then the Council arbiter spoke, and this being was made of gas trapped inside a crystal shell, and when it talked, the whole station seemed to vibrate, and it announced that not only was humanity's petition denied, but the Council was also placing trade restrictions on the entire solar system, and humans would only be allowed basic resource exchanges and no advanced technology, and no military equipment, and worst of all, no access to the hyperspace lanes beyond their immediate neighborhood. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face because these restrictions would destroy Earth's growing economy and isolate humanity from the rest of the galaxy, and he demanded the right to appeal this unfair decision, but the Vrix delegate just spread its mandibles in what might have been a smile and said there was no appeal, and humans should accept their place, and maybe in 1,000 years they would be ready. The session ended, and Daniel and Amy gathered their materials while every species in the chamber watched them, and as they walked to the docking bay, Amy spoke quietly and said this decision made no sense, because she had reviewed admission records, and species with much worse histories than humanity had been granted membership without any problems. Daniel agreed and told her that the Council was not rejecting humans because they were unqualified, but because the Council feared what humanity might become if given a chance to grow, and they boarded their shuttle where Lieutenant Jack Morris was waiting, and he asked how it went, but their faces told him everything, and Daniel just said to get them back to their ship because they needed to report to Earth immediately. The shuttle flew through space toward the human vessel ESS Horizon, which was waiting at the edge of the system, and through the window Daniel could see Council Station Alpha, which was so ancient that no living species remembered who built it, and thousands of ships from hundreds of worlds surrounded it, showing just how big and powerful the galactic community really was. Amy said that humanity would not accept this rejection, and Daniel said nothing because he knew she was right, and Earth had spent decades reaching for the stars and dreaming of joining the great civilizations, and to be rejected so completely would be seen as an insult that demanded a response. 3 days later, they docked with the Horizon, and Captain Lisa Monroe met them with bad news because she had already received a report from Earth, and the response was exactly what Daniel feared, which was outrage and anger and calls for everything, from severing all contact to launching formal complaints, and then Lisa told him something else that made everything more complicated. Earth was sending Ambassador Peter Grant to take over the diplomatic mission, and Daniel knew this name because Grant was one of Earth's best diplomats who had ended the resource wars, and if anyone could change the Council's mind, it was him. But Daniel felt uneasy because the dismissive way the Council had treated humanity suggested something deeper than simple prejudice. The week passed quickly while the crew prepared, and when Ambassador Grant arrived in his ship called the ESS Messenger, he brought 2 escort frigates, which was a clear message that Earth would not be ignored, and Grant was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and a face that showed decades of hard negotiations, and he shook Daniel's hand firmly and said he had read the report 3 times and believed the rejection was about power, not qualifications. Grant spent 2 days reviewing everything and interviewing everyone and preparing a new approach, and his strategy was bold, because he would not ask for membership, but would demand an explanation for why humanity was being treated differently than other species, and he said the Council expected humans to beg, but instead they would challenge the Council to justify their decision in front of everyone. The plan was risky, but it was all they had left, and Daniel went back to Council Station with Grant along with a full security detail and recording equipment to document everything, and the Council reconvened 3 days later, and Grant stood at the podium looking small but commanding despite being surrounded by beings from civilizations millions of years old. Grant spoke clearly and said he was not there to plead but to demand accountability, because the Galactic Community Charter required all membership decisions to be justified with clear reasoning, and the rejection of humanity had contained no such justification, and the chamber erupted with alien sounds, and the Arbiter pulsed with angry orange light and asked how a human dared question the Council's wisdom. Grant replied calmly that he questioned a decision that appeared arbitrary and discriminatory, and he asked them to show the specific problems with humanity's application and provide evidence for why humanity was unsuitable when species with documented histories of conquest and genocide had been allowed to join, and the VRIX delegate hissed that the Council was not obligated to explain itself to primitives. Grant smiled, but it was not a warm smile, and he said then the Council admitted its decision was based on prejudice and not qualifications, and he said Earth would respond accordingly, and he turned to leave. But the Kelvin representative stopped him and asked what he meant by respond accordingly. Grant looked back and said that humanity would no longer follow Council restrictions they never agreed to, and humans would trade with whoever they wanted and travel wherever they wanted and defend their interests however they saw fit. And if the Council did not recognize human sovereignty, then humans did not recognize the Council's authority over them. The chamber exploded with outrage, and dozens of delegates shouted at once, creating a wall of incomprehensible noise. But Grant walked calmly toward the exit with Daniel and the security team surrounding him, and they almost reached the corridor when the blast hit, and the explosion tore through the human delegation's area, throwing bodies across the chamber. Daniel felt himself lifted into the air, and his world became spinning chaos and light and pain. And he hit something hard that knocked all the breath from his lungs, and then everything went dark. And when consciousness returned, it came with pain and the smell of burning metal, and he opened his eyes to see Amy's terrified face above him with blood running from a cut on her forehead. Amy was shouting and asking if he could hear her, and Daniel tried to speak but coughed and tasted blood, and he asked what happened, and Amy said someone had planted a bomb in their section, and then she said words that made Daniel's blood run cold, which were that Ambassador Grant was gone, and when Daniel asked what she meant, Amy said the ambassador was dead along with 6 security team members and 3 Council Station workers. Daniel forced himself to sit up despite his broken ribs protesting, and around him the chamber was chaos with emergency crews swarming everywhere, and through the smoke he could see the scorched crater where the human area had been, and he told Amy to help him up because they needed to secure their people and get off the station immediately. They gathered the survivors, which was only 15 people out of the 26 who had entered the chamber, and Council security tried to detain them for questioning, but Daniel refused and said their ambassador had been murdered during a diplomatic session under Council protection, and they were leaving, and if anyone tried to stop them, it would be considered an act of war. Maybe it was the steel in his voice, or maybe the security forces recognized the situation was already out of control, but they let the humans go, and the news hit Earth like a bomb, and within hours every screen on the planet showed Ambassador Peter Grant's face, followed by footage of his life and his family, and his decades of service to humanity, and in the United Earth Assembly chamber in Geneva representatives from every nation gathered for an emergency session that would decide humanity's response to this act of war. General Nathan Cross stood before the assembled representatives wearing his uniform with the insignia of Combined Military Command, and he told them that 6 hours ago, their ambassador had been assassinated while performing his duties and analysis. of the debris showed it was a military-grade antimatter device that no civilian could access on Council Station, and this meant the murder was deliberate and ordered by someone with power. The chamber erupted in angry voices, and Assembly Speaker Margaret Lewis had to call for order multiple times before people would quiet down and listen. And she asked General Cross what the military's assessment was, and Nathan pulled up holographic displays showing the station and surrounding space and explained that intelligence suggested this was ordered or permitted by the Council itself, because security on that station was too tight for such a device to be smuggled without inside help. Nathan spoke clearly and said the Council had murdered Earth's ambassador to send a message, which was that humanity should know its place and accept isolation and restrictions without complaint, and that if humans pushed back, the Council would push harder. And Representative Carlos Mendez asked what the general was proposing, and Nathan said the military stood ready to respond to whatever the Assembly decided, but he would be frank that they could not allow this to go unanswered because, if they did, it would signal to every species that human lives had no value. The debate lasted 18 hours, and representatives argued about proportional response and diplomatic solutions, and economic sanctions and military action, and some called for restraint, warning that humanity could not fight the entire galaxy, while others demanded immediate retaliation, insisting that weakness would invite more aggression, and in the end the vote was nearly unanimous, as the Assembly passed Resolution 847, formally declaring that the murder of Ambassador Grant was an act of war, and authorizing the military to take all necessary actions to secure justice. General Cross wasted no time, and within hours orders went out to every military installation in the solar system and beyond, and shipyards that had been making civilian vessels switched to military production, and reserve units were activated, and the combined fleet, which had numbered just over 300 ships before the crisis, began mobilizing, on a scale not seen since the resource wars decades earlier. At the lunar shipyards, Admiral Linda Hayes watched as final components were installed on the ESS Vengeance, which was humanity's first dreadnought-class vessel designed with one purpose, which was to fight and win against any opponent, and its armor could withstand antimatter explosions, and its weapons included railguns that fired projectiles at incredible speeds, along with nuclear missiles, and humanity's first directed energy weapons. Captain Kyle Murphy reported that final systems checks were complete, and the Vengeance was ready for combat operations, and Admiral Hayes nodded and said that in 3 days, they would take the ship and the entire Third Fleet to Council Station Alpha, because it was time the galaxy learned that humanity would not be silenced. And across Earth and throughout the solar system, similar preparations happened as Mars colonial forces readied ships and asteroid belt mining vessels were retrofitted with weapons and armor. But military mobilization was only part of Earth's response, and in the intelligence headquarters in London, Director Karen White reviewed reports from human operatives throughout the galaxy, and what she read troubled her deeply, because the evidence showed the assassination was ordered by a coalition of council species, led by the Vricks and Kelvins, who saw humanity as a threat to their dominance in the galactic economy. Agent Paul Drake asked how humanity could threaten civilizations millions of years old, when humans were barely a century into space exploration, and Karen pulled up economic charts showing that in 70 years humanity had established colonies on 42 worlds, and trade networks were expanding at a rate that made established powers nervous, because they had spent millions of years carving up the galaxy and did not want to make room for newcomers. Paul said the Council had tried to intimidate humans by killing their ambassador and had made a serious miscalculation, and Karen agreed, but said they needed more than military strength because they needed allies, and there had to be species in the Council who disagreed with what happened, and she ordered her people to find them and make contact and show them that humanity was not the threat, but the current Council leadership was. The intelligence operation that followed was ambitious, and agents made contact with dozens of species, including many younger civilizations, who had felt the weight of Council domination, and the message was simple, which was that Earth was standing up to tyranny and asking others to stand with them, and some species refused out of fear, but others listened, including the Tauran, who had been denied membership for centuries, and the Zal, whose home system had been plundered by Council-sanctioned mining, and the Heron, who were warriors that respected strength and despised cowardice. One by one, representatives from these species came to Earth in secret and met with human officials, and an alliance began forming, not of the strongest species, but of those who believed the galactic order needed to change. And meanwhile, Commander Daniel Harper recovered from his injuries at a military hospital in Geneva, where doctors said he was lucky because broken ribs and a concussion were minor compared to what could have been. As Daniel lay in his hospital bed watching news reports about Earth's mobilization, he received a visitor, which was General Nathan Cross, who came into the room and told Daniel to stay at ease because he was there to talk, not conduct an inspection. And Daniel said he should have seen the attack coming and should have anticipated violence. But Nathan said Daniel had been sent on a diplomatic mission, not military operation, and the responsibility lay with those who planted the bomb. Nathan sat down and spoke quietly, telling Daniel that in 3 days Admiral Hayes would take the Third Fleet to Council Station Alpha to deliver an ultimatum, which was to hand over everyone involved in the assassination or face consequences, and Daniel said the Council would never agree, and Nathan replied probably not, which was why the Third Fleet was not going alone, because they had positioned ships throughout the region, and if the Council refused, they would demonstrate what happened when you murdered human diplomats. Daniel felt a chill and asked if they were planning to attack the station, and Nathan said only if forced, but made it clear that the days of humanity meekly accepting whatever the galaxy handed them were over, because they had tried peace and diplomacy, and the response had been murder. So now the Council would face soldiers instead of messengers. 2 days later, Daniel was released from hospital against medical advice and reported to Fleet Command, where he was surprised to find himself promoted to captain and given command of the ESS Retribution, which was a new heavy cruiser fresh from the shipyards, and his first officer was Amy Patterson, also promoted, and his crew was filled with veterans who had served on the frontier. Amy explained that commands were being given to everyone who survived the assassination, because the Admiral wanted people who had seen firsthand what the Council was capable of, and the Retribution was a beautiful ship carrying enough firepower to reduce a small moon to rubble and engines that could push it faster than most alien vessels. But what impressed Daniel most was the crew, because every person aboard had volunteered, knowing they might be sailing into war. On the bridge, Daniel sat in the captain's chair and activated ship-wide communication, and told everyone that in 18 hours they would join the Third Fleet for departure to Council Station Alpha, and their mission was simple, which was to demand justice for Ambassador Grant. And if they did not get it, they would take it, and he would not lie, because this was dangerous, since the Council had thousands of ships and millions of soldiers, and technology humans were only beginning to understand. But Daniel also said they had something the Council did not, which was that they were fighting for a cause they believed in, and fighting for their right to exist as equals, and fighting for every human who would come after them, so those people would never have to bow to tyranny. And he told them to make preparations and say prayers if they had them, and get ready to show the galaxy what humanity was made of. The crew's response was a roar that echoed through the corridors, and Daniel exchanged a look with Amy, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes, and the Third Fleet assembled at Mars orbital platforms, which was a sight that would have been unimaginable a month earlier, with over 100 ships ranging from small frigates to the massive Vengeance forming up in perfect military precision. At Admiral Hayes's command, the fleet entered hyperspace, disappearing from the solar system in a flash of distorted light, and the journey took 3 days, during which the fleet conducted constant drills preparing for every possible scenario, and Daniel barely slept as his mind ran through tactical simulations and worst-case scenarios. But he also found time to record a message to his family. 6 months after the standoff at Council Station Alpha, the galaxy was still adjusting to the new reality, and the Council had been restructured, with humanity holding a permanent seat on the Security Committee, alongside 20 other species, and the old guard led by the Vricks and Kelvins had lost much of their influence, though they remained vocal opponents of every change. Captain Daniel Harper stood in his office aboard the newly constructed ESS Defender, which was the flagship of Earth's Fourth Fleet, and through the viewport he could see construction drones working on defensive stations positioned throughout the solar system, because Earth was no longer a minor player, content to accept whatever role the galaxy assigned, and his desk terminal chimed with an incoming message from Admiral Hayes. The Admiral's face appeared on the screen, and she asked if Daniel was settling into his new command, and said she had an assignment for him. And Daniel straightened in his chair and said he was ready, and Hayes explained that they had received reports of pirate activity in the frontier sectors, targeting trade ships from coalition species and the Council's traditional forces, had been slow to respond, likely because many attacks were hitting their allies rather than council-client species. Hayes said she wanted Daniel to take a task force and put an end to the pirate problem, and Daniel pulled up a star chart showing the frontier sectors, which was a region far from the galactic core where oversight was minimal and lawlessness was common, and he asked about fleet composition. And Hayes said his flagship plus 3 heavy cruisers and 6 frigates, along with 2 Tauran destroyers and a Zal carrier, making this a joint operation to show the galaxy that the coalition practiced what it preached about mutual defense. Daniel asked when they would deploy, and Hayes said as soon as the task force assembled, and then she added that this was important because the old council forces were watching and waiting for the coalition to fail so they could claim the new structure. Did not work, and she told him not to give them that satisfaction. The task force assembled at Mars Orbital Station 2 days later, and Daniel watched as alien ships took their positions in the formation, and he marveled at how much had changed in just months, because 6 months ago these species would have been wary of working with humans, but now they flew under unified command without hesitation. Commander Vala appeared on his view screen, and since their first meeting during the confrontation at Council Station, she had become a regular presence in coalition operations, and her blue skin and silver eyes gave her an ethereal quality. But Daniel had learned she was as tough as any human officer, and she said her ships were ready to deploy, and it would be good to hunt together again. The Zal representative was a hulking reptilian named Krax who embodied everything warrior culture implied, and his species communicated through vocal sounds and pheromones that made translation difficult, but his message was clear, which was that his carrier group was ready for combat, and the task force entered hyperspace, traveling toward the frontier sectors. The journey took 4 days, giving Daniel time to work with his fellow commanders on tactics and coordination, and despite their different backgrounds, they found common language in the mathematics of warfare and the shared goal of protecting innocent lives, and they emerged from hyperspace in the Dalvor system, which was a busy trading hub that had been hit by 3 pirate raids in the past month. The local governor, who was a Rylan named Selos, met with them via subspace communication and thanked them for responding to calls for help, and explained that council patrol forces had been stretched thin and pirates had been growing bolder, and Daniel asked about their operations, and Selos transmitted data files showing that pirates struck fast-targeting cargo vessels in hyperspace transition zones, and by the time defense forces responded, the pirates were gone. Daniel studied the attack patterns with Amy, who was now his executive officer, and Lieutenant Commander Brandon Cole, who was his tactical officer, and a pattern emerged quickly because the attacks were not random, and Brandon highlighted several data points showing they hit when Allied ships were most vulnerable, right as they exited hyperspace before shields fully stabilized. Amy said this meant they had inside information because someone was feeding them ship schedules and routes, and Daniel nodded and told Governor Selos they would need access to traffic control data for the past 3 months, including all internal communications, and there was hesitation because some information was confidential and commercial entities paid significant fees for privacy protection. Daniel replied flatly that those commercial entities were dying, and the choice was simple, which was give them the data and help catch pirates or watch the economy collapse as traders avoided the system entirely, and Selos transmitted the data, and the task force spent 2 days analyzing it while maintaining high alert patrols. Amy found the smoking gun when she discovered a pattern in unauthorized transmissions from the traffic control center, showing someone had been sending encrypted burst transmissions to a location in the outer system right before each attack, and the encryption was good, but she compared it to known pirate communication protocols and found a match. Daniel asked if she could trace the source, and Amy said she already had because it was coming from within the governor's own staff, specifically his chief commercial officer, who was a human named Eric Walton, and the revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow because a human was selling out other humans and aliens for profit. Amy confirmed she was absolutely certain and explained that Walton had been paid over 4 million credits through shell companies because the pirates had been giving him a cut of every raid, and Daniel made a decision to notify Governor Selos immediately and have Walton arrested before he could run, and to prep a strike team, because if they had transmission logs, they could track the pirates back to their base. The arrest happened within an hour, as Eric Walton was taken into custody by local security forces, and his face appeared on news feeds across the sector, and the story of a human trader profiting from piracy sparked outrage throughout the coalition. But Daniel had no time to worry about public relations, because the transmission logs revealed the pirates' base of operations in an asteroid facility in an uninhabited system 2 jumps away. Daniel called his commanders together for a final briefing and showed them tactical scans of the facility, explaining this would be a hard target because the asteroid had been hollowed out and fortified with at least 20 ships and possibly anti-ship defenses, and they would be going in without surprise because once they entered the system, the pirates would know they were coming. Crack said through his translator that they would hit hard and fast because Zal warriors did not fear battle. But Vala was more cautious and asked about hostages because several captured crew members from raided ships were likely still alive in that facility, and Daniel agreed this needed to be a precision operation using railguns to knock out sensor arrays and communications, then dropping assault teams while the fleet engaged their ships for a quick clean operation with minimal collateral damage. The attack began 48 hours later as the task force emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system and accelerated toward the asteroid base at maximum speed, and the pirates responded immediately with their ships scrambling to intercept. And Brandon reported 23 vessels, which were a mixture of converted cargo ships and light raiders, forming a defensive screen around the asteroid. Daniel ordered all ships weapons free and told Tauran destroyers to take the left flank and the Zal carrier to deploy fighters and hit from above, while human ships went straight down the middle, and the battle that followed was brief but intense because pirate ships were fast and maneuverable but lacked the firepower and armor of military vessels. The defenders' railguns tore through their defenses while Tauran destroyers used advanced shields to absorb incoming fire and return it with devastating energy weapons, and Zal fighters swarmed the enemy like angry hornets, and within 20 minutes the pirate fleet was destroyed or fleeing. Daniel wasted no time ordering assault teams launched because he wanted the base secured before they could execute hostages, and the assault shuttles carried a mixed force of human marines and Tauran commandos and Zal shock troops racing toward the asteroid, and they breached the facility's docking bays and fought through corridors filled with desperate pirates in vicious close quarters, fighting where training and discipline made the difference between life and death. Lieutenant Jake Foster led the human marine contingent, and his team moved through the facility with practiced efficiency, finding the first group of hostages in improvised cells near the power core, and he reported to the defender that they found survivors with about 50 people in mixed species who were in bad shape but alive. Daniel told him to get them out and continue the sweep and asked about resistance, and Jake said it was light to moderate because these were not soldiers, just criminals who knew they were finished, and most surrendered when they saw coalition forces coming, and the sweep took 3 hours, and by the end they had rescued 62 hostages and captured over 100 pirates and secured enough evidence to track down the criminal network funding the operation. The victory was complete and decisive, but as Daniel walked through the recovered cargo bays, seeing stolen goods that represented ruined lives in the Coalition Senate chamber on Earth was a marvel of engineering and diplomacy, built in orbit above Geneva, and it featured a massive circular assembly hall where representatives from 47 species gathered to debate and argue and occasionally agree on the direction of the growing alliance, and the architecture deliberately avoided favoring any one species, resulting in a strange but functional blend of styles that somehow worked together. Rear Admiral Daniel Harper stood in the observation gallery, watching the proceedings below, and after 18 months of patrol duty in the frontier sectors, he had been recalled to Earth to testify before the Military Affairs Committee about the Coalition's expansion into previously ungoverned space. And the numbers told an impressive story because piracy had dropped by 70%, and trade had increased 5-fold, and 12 new species had petitioned to join the coalition. But not everyone was happy about the changes, and in the Senate chamber below, a Kelvin representative was making that abundantly clear as he argued that this human-led coalition was nothing more than a new empire claiming to promote freedom and equality while placing military bases throughout the frontier sectors, and making trade agreements that favored coalition species, and always having human ships at the center of operations. Senator Maria Gonzalez, who was Earth's senior representative, responded calmly, saying, "The representative mistook organization for oppression, and the coalition did not rule the frontier sectors, but protected them, and any species was welcome to join patrol operations, and many already did. But the Kelvin shot back that everything was under human command and under human rules and under human guns." Commander Vala of the Tauran delegation stood and her blue skin darkened with emotion, as she said she was tired of this debate because her people had suffered under the old council's neglect for generations. And when pirates raided their colonies, the council patrols were nowhere to be found, and there was no protection despite paying taxes and tribute. But the humans had offered partnership, and the Tauran accepted because it was better than what they had before. The debate continued for hours, and Daniel watched it all, recognizing the political theater for what it was. Because the old council species, particularly the Vricks and Kelvins, were trying to slow the coalition's growth through parliamentary tactics, since they could not fight the New Order militarily after the disaster at Council Station, so they attacked through politics and propaganda instead. After the session, Daniel met with Admiral Hayes and General Nathan Cross in a secure conference room deep within the Senate station, and the three of them had worked together for 2 years now, forming a command structure that had proven remarkably effective, and Nathan said without preamble that the political situation was deteriorating because intelligence services were reporting coordinated campaigns to undermine the coalition. Nathan explained there were fake news stories about human atrocities and economic analyses predicting their collapse and diplomatic efforts to keep neutral species from joining. And Admiral Hayes added that it was working because 3 species that were close to joining had suddenly gone quiet, and there were rumblings from some existing members about the costs of coalition membership. Daniel leaned back in his chair and asked how they should respond, and Nathan said carefully because any overreaction would play into the narrative that they were aggressive expansionists, but if they did not respond at all, they would look weak and indecisive, and the discussion was interrupted by an urgent communication from Captain Amy Patterson, who was now commanding the ESS Guardian in the outer colonies. Amy's face appeared on the view screen, and Daniel immediately saw the stress in her expression as she reported that the colony world of New Terra was reporting an incoming fleet of unknown vessels that were broadcasting no identification, and not responding to hails with an estimated arrival time of 4 hours. New Terra was a human colony established only 3 years earlier and home to nearly 50,000 settlers, and it was also strategically located on a major hyperspace route, making it valuable real estate in the increasingly crowded galaxy. And Admiral Hayes asked about Amy's current position, and she said 16 hours out at maximum speed. Amy explained that the Colonial Defense Force had 6 patrol ships, but they were not equipped for serious combat, and if this was a hostile force they would not last long, and Daniel was already calling up tactical displays, asking who else they had in the region. And Nathan checked fleet disposition, saying the Zal carrier group under Krax was 10 hours away, and they had 2 Tauran destroyers on patrol about 12 hours out. Daniel said it was not enough time and told Amy to get her ship moving and transmit all sensor data to Fleet Command, while they coordinated a response from Earth. And as Amy's image disappeared, Admiral Hayes turned to her staff, ordering them to get the Coalition Council on a priority channel, because they needed to invoke Article 7 of the Charter. Article 7 was the Coalition's mutual defense clause, stating that an attack on any member species was an attack on all, and it had been invoked twice before, but never for a situation involving Earth directly. And within minutes, representatives from every Coalition species were connected through a secured channel as Admiral Hayes laid out the situation concisely. Hayes said New Terra was facing a potential attack, and they had insufficient forces in the region to guarantee the colony's safety, and under Article 7 she was requesting immediate military assistance from all Coalition members capable of reaching the system within 24 hours, and there was a moment of silence before Commander Vala spoke, saying, "The Tauran Third Fleet could have 8 ships in the system within 18 hours, and they were deploying now." Krax's growling voice came through, saying the Zal carrier group was already en route and would be there in 10 hours. And one by one other species pledged support as the Heron sent 4 cruisers, and the Ryland dispatched a hospital ship and medical teams, and even smaller Coalition members contributed what they could, including scout ships and supply vessels and diplomatic envoys. In just 30 minutes, a relief force of over 40 ships was converging on New Terra from across a dozen systems, and it was an impressive demonstration of the Coalition's strength and unity. But it was also a race against time, and Daniel requested and received permission to take personal command of the defense. Within an hour, he was aboard a fast courier ship heading for New Terra, at speeds that would have been impossible with a larger vessel, and with him was Lieutenant Commander Brandon Cole and a team of tactical specialists. And Brandon said, during the flight, that they had analyzed the sensor data from New Terra, and the incoming fleet consisted of approximately 30 ships, all matching known pirate configurations, but something was off. Daniel asked what he meant, and Brandon explained that the ships were too organized, moving in proper military formations, and pirates did not typically have that kind of discipline, so he thought they were looking at mercenaries, possibly sponsored by someone who did not want their involvement traced. Daniel absorbed that information because a mercenary fleet attacking a human colony had serious implications, and if the old council species were behind it, they were escalating from political opposition to proxy warfare, and the courier arrived at New Terra 12 hours before the incoming fleet, and the planet appeared peaceful on the view screen, as a blue-green world that reminded Daniel of Earth. He established command aboard the Colonial Defense Station, which was a modest orbital facility that housed administrative offices, and the small defense fleet, and the colonial governor, who was a woman named Helen Price, met him with obvious relief, saying thank God he was there, because they had been tracking that fleet since it entered sensor range and they were definitely hostile. Helen explained that about an hour ago the fleet had transmitted a message demanding they evacuate the planet and surrender it to their control, and Daniel asked why, and she said some claim about New Terra being established on contested space, and that they were occupying a system that belonged to the Kelvin people, but her expression was skeptical, because this system was unclaimed when they arrived, and they had filed all proper documentation with the Galactic Registry. Daniel exchanged a look with Brandon because the Kelvins were involved, which meant their opponents were willing to use force after all. And over the next few hours, the Coalition relief force began arriving with Captain Amy Patterson and the Guardian, first followed by the Zal carrier group, and then the Tauren destroyers, and soon the orbital space around New Terra was filled with Coalition warships taking up defensive positions. But the incoming mercenary fleet did not slow down, and if anything, they accelerated, clearly intent on engaging the defense force before more ships could arrive, and Daniel opened a channel to all Coalition vessels, saying they were about to face an enemy force that likely expected them to break and run, because they were used to fighting poorly defended colonies, not coordinated military operations. Daniel explained that human ships would anchor the center, while Tauren vessels took the flanks and Zal fighters would harry their formation and draw out escort ships while colonial defense forces protected the orbital stations, and he told them to stay in communication and support each other, and remember they were not just defending New Terra, but defending the principle that Coalition space was inviolate. 3 years after the attack on New Terra, the Coalition had grown to include 73 species and controlled or protected over 200 systems, and the old council still existed, but its authority had been reduced to a fraction of what it once was, and most species now recognized two power centers in the galaxy, which were the Traditionalist Council and the Reformist Coalition. Admiral Daniel Harper now commanded the Coalition Defense Fleet, which was a position that made him one of the most powerful military figures in known space, and his flagship, the ESS Unbreakable, was a command carrier that served as mobile headquarters for Coalition operations across the galaxy, and at his side, as always, was Captain Amy Patterson, who now commanded the ship's day-to-day operations while Daniel focused on strategic planning. The bridge was a marvel of integrated technology with systems from a dozen species working seamlessly together, and human, and Tauren and Zal and Heron and other species crew members worked side by side in the unified command structure that had seemed impossible 4 years ago, but was now routine. And Lieutenant Sarah Kim at Communications reported an incoming transmission from Earth saying it was General Cross, and he said it was urgent. Daniel took the call in his ready room and Nathan's face appeared on the screen, and Daniel immediately noticed the worry lines that seemed deeper than before, and Nathan said they had intercepted communications suggesting the Vrix were planning something big, because intelligence indicated they had been building a fleet in secret far beyond their registered shipyards, with best estimates putting it at over 500 warships. Daniel felt his blood run cold because 500 ships was more than the entire Coalition fleet, and he asked where they were building them. And Nathan said that was the problem because they did not know. And the communications they intercepted were deliberately vague, but the Vrix were calling it the Reclamation Fleet, with the stated purpose being to restore proper order to the galaxy. Daniel said the translation was that they wanted to crush the Coalition and return things to how they were, And Nathan said exactly, and the security committee was meeting in 4 hours, and they wanted his assessment of military readiness. And Daniel spent the next 3 hours reviewing fleet deployments and ship readiness reports and tactical analyses. And the numbers were not encouraging. The coalition had grown rapidly, but much of that growth had focused on patrol operations and defense, and in a direct military confrontation with a purpose-built war fleet. The outcome was uncertain, and the Security Committee meeting included representatives from every major coalition species as Daniel presented his findings via holographic projection, showing fleet strengths and likely VRIX capabilities and potential scenarios. Daniel explained that their advantage was quality and coordination, because coalition ships were newer and better maintained than council vessels, and their crews trained together regularly, and they had developed tactics that leveraged each species' strengths, but the VRIX fleet would likely be larger, though they would be using outdated command structures and ships that had not seen combat in centuries. Senator Gonzalez asked the question everyone was thinking, which was whether they could win, and Daniel was quiet for a moment before answering that. In a direct fleet engagement, it would be close, and they might prevail, but casualties would be catastrophic, with potentially tens of thousands dead and hundreds of ships destroyed, and even if they won, the coalition would be severely weakened. Commander Vala leaned forward and asked what he recommended, and Daniel said they needed to find the VRIX fleet before they were ready to deploy and catch them while they were still scattered among their secret shipyards, and hit them hard enough that they could not launch a coordinated attack, and they needed to do it soon before they were at full strength. The committee debated for 6 hours as some members argued for immediate action, while others wanted more intelligence gathering, and a few advocated for diplomatic solutions trying to negotiate before warfare became inevitable. But eventually, a consensus emerged that the coalition would launch a preemptive strike against the VRIX fleet, but only after locating their shipyards and confirming the threat. Over the next 2 months, coalition intelligence services worked around the clock as human operatives and Tauran analysts and Zal scouts and agents from a dozen other species pieced together fragments of information including shipping manifests, showing unusual resource movements and energy signatures in supposedly empty systems, and reports from traders about mysterious construction activities in remote regions. Finally, they had it, which was 3 hidden shipyards in systems far from regular trade routes, and each was building portions of the reclamation fleet, and the VRIX had been clever splitting their construction across multiple sites to reduce the chance of discovery, but that same distribution created a vulnerability, because the fleet was divided and could not mutually support itself. Daniel planned the operation with the same commanders he had worked with for years, as Amy would lead the attack on the first shipyard with a battle group of 20 ships, and Commander Vala would take the second with a combined Tauran Heron force, while Daniel would personally command the assault on the third and largest shipyard, which intelligence suggested was the fleet's main assembly point. Daniel explained during the final briefing that the key was coordination, because they would hit all 3 sites simultaneously, and if they gave warning, the VRIX would rally their completed ships for a defensive stand, so they needed to catch them. Unprepared, and Krax, who now commanded the Zal 5th Fleet, growled agreement, saying it would be a quick strike to destroy the shipyards and unfinished vessels, leaving them unable to launch their planned attack. Daniel emphasized that their goal was to eliminate the military threat, not to massacre the VRIX people, and they should offer surrender to any ship that lowered its weapons and take prisoners where possible, because they were not like the old council, and did not resort to genocide to solve their problems. And the fleets deployed 3 days later, traveling through hyperspace along carefully plotted routes designed to bring them all to their targets at the same moment. The journey took 5 days, during which Daniel barely slept as he reviewed tactical plans and ran simulations, and tried to anticipate everything that could go wrong. And on the bridge of the Unbreakable, he stood with his command staff as the ship prepared to exit hyperspace, and around him, 47 coalition warships did the same in the largest military operation in the coalition's short history. Amy announced that all ships reported ready, and they would exit hyperspace in 30 seconds, and Daniel opened a fleet-wide channel, saying that in a moment they were going to strike a blow for freedom and security, because the VRIX leadership thought they could build a fleet in secret and use it to destroy everything the coalition had built. But they were wrong, because the coalition found them and was stopping them and showing the galaxy that they would not be intimidated or destroyed. Reality twisted as 47 ships simultaneously dropped out of hyperspace into the Vrick shipyard system, and the scene that greeted them was both impressive and terrifying, because the shipyard was massive, with a sprawling complex of construction, docks and assembly platforms that stretched across millions of kilometers, and filling those docks were ships with hundreds of them, in various stages of completion. The tactical officer reported contact with 163 vessels, and 60 were showing active power signatures, while the rest appeared to be incomplete, and Daniel ordered them to target the active ships first and destroy the shipyard infrastructure second, and broadcast their demand for surrender on all frequencies. The Coalition fleet surged forward with weapons hot and shields at maximum, and the Vrick ships, caught by surprise, scrambled to respond as some tried to fight, launching missiles and energy weapons at the attackers, while others attempted to flee, with their incomplete systems failing under the strain. And a few, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, lowered their shields and transmitted surrender codes. The battle was chaos as ships exploded in brilliant flashes when railgun rounds tore through their hulls, and energy beams carved glowing scars across the darkness of space, and missiles streaked between vessels, with some finding targets and others, intercepted by point defense systems, and the Unbreakable led the charge with its massive bulk-absorbing fire, meant for smaller ships, while its weapon batteries systematically destroyed Vrick's vessels. Daniel watched the tactical display, calling out targets and coordinating fleet movements, with a calmness that belied the violence around him, and he ordered the second wave to concentrate fire on the construction platforms because he wanted those facilities rendered inoperable. And Human and Torin and Zal and other Coalition ships moved in precise formation, with their attacks methodical and devastating. Within an hour, the Vrick's fleet's main assembly point was a field of debris and disabled ships, and the shipyard infrastructure burned, with its massive construction docks twisted and broken, and reports came in from the other battle groups as Amy had successfully destroyed the second shipyard with minimal Coalition casualties, and Vala's force had faced heavier resistance, but ultimately prevailed, capturing several intact Vrick's vessels in the process. The Vrick's reclamation fleet, before it ever had a chance to deploy, was broken, and Daniel ordered rescue operations